What it was like to travel from London to India in 1800. There was a woman standing near a window in a house in Leadenhall Street, London, in the spring of 1800, watching a cart being loaded in the street below. The cart was wide and the street was narrow, and the men loading it had to work around the usual flow of foot traffic and other vehicles without stopping either. The cart was taking trunks to a wharf on the Thames, and the trunks belonged to her husband, who had been appointed to a position in the Bengal presidency and was to sail within the fortnight. She was going with him. They had been married for 3 years. She had never been more than 50 miles from London in her life. The trunks contained a great deal. They contained clothes for every anticipated climate, because the journey from England to India in 1800 passed through a range of weather conditions that required a wardrobe capable of handling English spring cold, Atlantic swells, the heat of the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually the sustained heat of the Indian coast. They contained books because the voyage would take between 4 and 6 months, depending on winds and stops, and there was nothing to read at sea except what you brought with you. They contained medicines because the ship's surgeon carried a general supply, but it was considered prudent to bring your own specific remedies. They contained a good quantity of tea and biscuits and various preserved foods because the food on the vessel would be adequate but not always pleasant, and having a private stock of better provisions was one of the accepted comforts of a long voyage. She watched the cart until it turned the corner, and then she turned back into the room, which was somewhat emptier than it had been the day before. This is a narration about what that journey was actually like, not the exceptional events, not the storms or the dramatic moments that occasionally occurred, but the ordinary experience of it, day after day, over the course of months. The system of provisioning and planning that preceded it, the infrastructure of ports and winds and trade routes that made it possible. The daily texture of life aboard a vessel making the passage to India at the beginning of the 19th century. The passage from England to India in 1800 was not a new undertaking. The route had been traveled regularly since the late 16th century, when the Portuguese had established it and the English East India Company had followed not long after. By 1800, 2 centuries of accumulated experience had shaped the route into a reasonably well-understood system, with established stopping points, known seasonal patterns, and a body of navigational knowledge that reduced, though it could not eliminate, the uncertainties of the voyage. The East India Company, which was the primary institutional vehicle for English and then British trade with India throughout this period, maintained its own fleet of vessels purpose-built for the India trade. These were called East Indiamen, and they were among the largest merchant vessels of their era, substantial ships of several hundred to over 1,000 tons burden, built to carry significant cargoes on long voyages and to be capable of defending themselves against the various threats they might encounter along the way. An East Indiaman in 1800 was typically between 500 and 1,200 tons. It was a 3-masted, square-rigged vessel with a deep hull capable of carrying a large cargo hold and a significant number of passengers in addition to the crew. The largest of these vessels had multiple gun decks and carried a substantial armament because the route to India passed through waters where they might encounter hostile vessels, and the company required its ships to be capable of resisting attack. The design of these ships reflected the specific requirements of the India trade. They needed to carry large cargoes of bulk goods, cotton textiles, spices, tea and porcelain going east and coming back, and various manufactured goods and silver going out. They needed to make the voyage to India and back in a reasonable time, while also being robust enough to handle the various sea conditions they would encounter. They needed to accommodate passengers because the carriage of passengers, particularly company employees and their families going out to India and returning, was a significant source of revenue. The passenger accommodation on an East Indiaman was organized in ways that reflected the social hierarchies of the period very directly. Senior company officials and wealthy private travelers could engage cabin space in the stern of the vessel, which was the most desirable location, being furthest from the bow where the pitching motion was most pronounced, and having windows that provided light and ventilation. These cabins were small by any land standard, but were relatively comfortable for the period, with a bunk, some storage space, and access to a shared saloon where passengers took their meals and spent time during the day. Further forward on the ship, and lower in the social hierarchy of the passenger accommodation, conditions were progressively less comfortable. Junior company employees, unattached young men going out to seek their fortunes in India, traveled in shared berths that offered much less privacy and much less space. Soldiers being transported to India, who were a regular part of the passenger manifest on many voyages, were accommodated in the most basic conditions, essentially in the lower decks of the vessel, in a way that was more similar to cargo than to the cabin accommodations available to paying passengers. The preparation for the voyage began weeks or months before the ship actually sailed. For passengers of any means, the preparation involved a substantial logistical effort that drew on the commercial infrastructure of London and the Thames side ports. The outfitting of a passenger for the India voyage was a recognized commercial activity, and there were firms in London that specialized in exactly this. They sold the trunks and cases that were needed, the particular kinds of storage containers designed to survive months at sea in a range of conditions, including potential flooding of the lower decks and the humid heat of the tropics. They sold the clothing appropriate to the climate of India, the lightweight cottons and linens that were suitable for the heat of Bengal or Madras, which were very different from the woolens that had been appropriate in England. They sold medicines and medical equipment, preserves and special foods, books and writing materials, and the various small items that would make a long voyage more comfortable. Acquiring all of this required navigating the commercial districts of London, which in 1800 was still organized around specific trades concentrated in specific streets and neighborhoods. The cloth merchants were in one area, the instrument makers in another, the booksellers in a third. The process of outfitting for a long voyage was a specific kind of shopping expedition that required knowledge of where to find what was needed and the time to do it. The cost of outfitting for the India voyage was significant. A passage on an East Indiaman to Bengal or Madras or Bombay cost between £100 and £200, depending on the cabin class, which was a substantial sum at a time when a skilled London craftsman might earn £50 or £60 a year. The outfitting on top of the passage added considerably more. Travel to India was an enterprise that required substantial resources, and most of those who undertook it did so because they expected to recover the investment through the salaries and opportunities available to them in India. The East India Company was one of the largest employers of Europeans going to India, and its employees in 1800 received salaries that were modest by the standards of their positions in England, but that were supplemented by various other income streams that made the posting financially attractive. The company maintained a monopoly on certain trades, and the unofficial commerce that grew up around this structure provided opportunities for individuals at many levels of the company hierarchy to accumulate wealth that would not have been available to them in equivalent positions at home. The military officers, civil servants, merchants, and various other categories of person who made the voyage to India in 1800 were therefore, for the most part, people who had made a deliberate calculation about the costs and benefits of an extended period away from England, working in a climate and culture that was entirely unfamiliar to them. The calculation was frequently positive, because India in 1800 was a place where Europeans could, under the right circumstances, accumulate significant wealth in a relatively short period. The combination of companies' salaries, trading opportunities, and the various forms of income that came with positions of authority in India's still complex political landscape made it a financially attractive destination for the right kind of person. The Thames, when a departing vessel slipped her moorings and began to move with the tide toward the sea, was one of the busiest stretches of water in the world. London's position as the commercial capital of a global trading empire meant that its river was continuously occupied with vessels of every description, from the small wherries and ferries that carried people across the river to the large East Indiamen that were proceeding to or returning from the far ends of the earth. The docks that lined the Thames were a world in themselves. The legal quays, where most dutiable goods had to be officially landed, were chronically overcrowded, and there had been growing pressure for decades to develop new dock facilities that could handle the volume of trade. In 1800, the first of the new enclosed docks was about to be authorized, though the West India docks that would open in 1802 had not yet been built. The warehousing and handling of goods was managed through a combination of facilities that were inadequate for the trade volume, but were what existed. The East End of London along the Thames was characterized by the smells and sounds of maritime commerce, tar and timber and rope, and the particular smell of cargoes from warm climates being unloaded into English cold. The shipyards at Blackwall, downstream from the city, were where many East Indiamen were built and where they returned for refitting between voyages. The Thames below London Bridge was essentially a working port of continuous activity, and a vessel departing for India made its way through this activity in the early stages of its voyage. Once below Gravesend, the river widened, and the characteristic London riverscape gave way to the flatter marshland of the Thames estuary. The vessel had to navigate the estuary carefully, using the established channels and the expertise of a river pilot who knew the particular hazards of this stretch of water. The estuary could be shallow in places and was subject to fogs that made navigation difficult, and the pilot's local knowledge was essential for getting the vessel safely to the open sea. The pilot was taken off the ship at some point in the outer estuary or the Downs, the anchorage area off the Kent coast, where vessels frequently paused to await favorable winds before proceeding up the channel or down toward the Atlantic. The Downs, sheltered by the Goodwin Sands, had been an important anchorage for centuries, and a vessel waiting for a fair wind there might be in company with dozens of other vessels similarly paused in their journeys. The English Channel was the first significant navigational challenge of the voyage. The Channel in 1800 was one of the most heavily trafficked stretches of water in the world, and it was also one of the most variable in its weather and sea conditions. Westerly winds, blowing against a vessel trying to reach the Atlantic, could make progress down the channel slow and uncomfortable. Easterly or northeasterly winds could allow fast passage, but required care in navigation through a body of water with numerous shoals, headlands, and the constant traffic of other vessels. The regular presence of French vessels was an additional complication in 1800. The Napoleonic Wars were ongoing, and the channel and the waters around it were contested. French privateers and occasionally French naval vessels were active in the channel approaches. And while a heavily armed East Indiaman was not a soft target, the possibility of encountering hostile shipping was real and required the ship's officers to maintain a level of vigilance that went beyond normal navigation. Passing through the Channel, the coast of England on one side and France on the other, a passenger who had not been to sea before would be experiencing the accumulated discomforts of early days at sea for the first time. Seasickness, which is extremely common among those not accustomed to the motion of a vessel, was the most immediate and unavoidable. The Channel, with its short, steep waves that created a particular corkscrew motion in vessels of this period, was not the easiest of introductions to sea travel. A passenger who had been fine on the Thames in the relatively sheltered and calm waters of the estuary often found the Channel something different entirely. The response to seasickness available in 1800 was essentially limited to fresh air and waiting. Various remedies were tried, ginger in various forms, particular foods or drinks lying down in particular positions, but none was reliably effective. The human body generally adapts to the motion of a vessel over a period of days to weeks, and most passengers who were going to adapt did so within the first week of the voyage. The first days were simply endured. The food on the vessel during the early part of the voyage was the best it would be for some time, because the fresh provisions loaded in England, bread, vegetables, fresh meat, butter, and eggs, were at their freshest and had not yet been consumed. The victualling arrangements on an East Indiaman were complex and carefully organized. The ship's cook prepared food for the entire crew, and the quality of this food was regulated by the company's standards. Passengers in the cabin accommodation ate at a separate table from the crew, and their food was somewhat better, prepared by a dedicated cook who drew on the cabin provisions rather than the general ship's stores. Beyond the channel, the vessel entered the Bay of Biscay, which had a well-established reputation among sailors as one of the more challenging stretches of water on the Atlantic approaches to European ports. The Bay of Biscay sits between the Atlantic swells coming in from the northwest and the relatively shallow waters over the continental shelf, and this combination can produce sea conditions that are particularly rough, with long Atlantic swells interacting with shorter, steeper waves in ways that make vessels pitch and roll heavily. A passenger in a cabin in the stern of the vessel, lying in a bunk that was gimbaled to stay level as the ship moved, listening to the sounds of the sea and the rigging and the creaking of the ship's structure around her, was having an experience that was both entirely new and entirely enclosed. The world outside existed only as noise and motion, rain against the stern windows, the sound of water moving along the hull, the occasional louder sound of a wave hitting the bow or breaking over the deck, and the continuous deep motion of the vessel in the swell. The ship's bells measured the passage of time as reliably as anything did. Every half hour, from 1 bell to 8 bells, through each 4-hour watch, the bell rang, and the watch changed at its end. The sound of the bell was constant through day and night and became, over the weeks of the voyage, a kind of clock that ordered experience in the absence of any other regular markers. Through the Bay of Biscay and down toward the latitude of the Iberian Peninsula, the character of the voyage was becoming established. The initial disorientation of departure and the specific discomforts of the channel were settling into the more regular pattern of open ocean sailing, which had its own rhythms that were different from but not necessarily worse than land life. The motion became familiar. The sounds of the ship became background rather than foreground. The days began to have a shape to them that was defined by the watches, the meals, and the various activities that filled the hours. The stop at Madeira was one of the defining features of the India voyage in this period. Madeira, the Portuguese island group in the North Atlantic, approximately 400 miles off the coast of Morocco, was a regular and important provisioning stop for vessels on the route to India. Its position, reachable within 2 to 3 weeks of leaving England in reasonable conditions, made it a natural first stop, where vessels could take on fresh water and provisions, and where passengers could have a brief but welcome interlude on land. Madeira was particularly associated with wine, and the Madeira wine trade was a significant element of the Atlantic commerce of the period. The sweet fortified wines produced on the island were highly regarded in England and in the American colonies and former colonies, and they traveled well precisely because they had been fortified with brandy in a way that made them resistant to the effects of heat and motion. The custom of taking on a supply of Madeira for the voyage ahead was essentially universal among passengers who could afford it, and the island's merchants had long experience in supplying ships' companies with their requirement. The anchorage at Funchal, Madeira's main town, was an open roadstead rather than an enclosed harbor, which meant that vessels anchored offshore and communicated with the town via small boats. In settled weather, this was entirely workable, but in rough weather, the landing was difficult and sometimes dangerous. Passengers going ashore were rowed in by boatmen who knew the local conditions, and the surf at the landing place required a degree of agility and cooperation between the passenger and the boatman to avoid getting wet or worse. Funchal itself, seen from the sea, climbed the hillside behind the waterfront in tiers of white-painted buildings with terraced vineyards on the slopes above the town and the dark volcanic peaks of the island's interior rising further still. The town was Portuguese in its administration and culture, with a significant English merchant community that had been established there for well over a century and maintained the networks of trade and hospitality that made the island useful to English vessels on the India route. The English merchants in Funchal had comfortable houses and maintained the kind of social life that was appropriate to their station, with dinners and entertainments for the officers and passengers of visiting vessels. A week in Funchal was a genuine social interlude in the long isolation of the voyage, with the opportunity to walk on solid ground, eat fresh food, drink good wine, and have conversations that were not circumscribed by the small community of a single ship. The time in Madeira was also used for whatever ship's business required attention. Water casks were refilled, fresh provisions were loaded, any minor repairs that had become apparent during the first weeks of the voyage could be addressed. Letters could be written and left with the island's merchant community for forwarding to England on the next vessel going north, and correspondence from England that had been sent ahead through the network of merchant houses might be awaiting the ship. Departing Madeira, the vessel began the section of the voyage that would take it south along the African coast toward the Cape Verde Islands and then across the equatorial Atlantic. The trade winds, blowing from the northeast in the North Atlantic, were the driving force for this section, and a vessel that had caught them could make good and consistent progress southward. The feel of the wind shifting from the variable westerlies of the Bay of Biscay to the steady northeast trades was one of the notable transitions of the voyage, marking a change in sailing character that was felt in the motion of the ship and in the changed attitude of the sails. The trade winds carried the ship south and southwest at a consistent speed, and the days in the trade wind belt could be among the most pleasant of the voyage. The sky was typically clear or lightly clouded. The sea was a deep blue with a moderate, steady swell. The temperature was warming pleasantly from the cold of England, and the ship moved smoothly and purposefully through the water. The discomforts of the early part of the voyage had been largely overcome by this point, and passengers who were going to adapt to sea life had adapted. Those who had not, who found the ocean simply incompatible with their constitution, were unfortunately in for many more weeks of misery. The social life of the cabin accommodation was developing its own patterns by this stage of the voyage. The passengers and officers who dined together had had enough time to become acquainted and to establish the social arrangements that would characterize the rest of the voyage. Who sat where at table, who walked with whom on deck, who played cards with whom in the evenings. These arrangements were negotiated and established in the first weeks and tended to persist. The captain of an East Indiaman occupied a social position that was particular to the ship. He was the ultimate authority in all things relating to the ship and its navigation, but he was also the host of the cabin table and responsible for the social atmosphere of the passenger accommodation. The captains of East Indiamen were substantial figures in the maritime world of the period, men who had typically worked their way up through the company's service over many years and who were paid accordingly. A captain of a large Indiaman could earn several £100 a year in salary, supplemented by the private trade privileges that were a traditional perquisite of the India captaincy. The private trade system, under which officers and even some senior crew members were allocated a specific amount of cargo space that they could use for their own account, was one of the distinctive features of the East India Company's shipping arrangements. It created a situation where the interests of the ship's officers were partially aligned with successful commercial operation, because they had their own goods aboard that they wanted to arrive safely and sell profitably. It also created complex negotiations about who could trade in what, where, and in what quantities, Because the private trade was conducted within a regulatory framework that the company tried to manage with varying success, the Cape Verde Islands, located in the Atlantic off the coast of Senegal, were another potential stopping point on the route, though not all voyages stopped there. The islands were Portuguese territory and had been settled since the 15th century, forming part of the infrastructure of the Atlantic slave trade and other commerce that crossed between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. They offered fresh water and provisions, and some voyages stopped for reprovisioning, particularly if the water supply was running low after the passage from Madeira. The Cape Verdes in 1800 were a place of mixed character. The main island of Santiago, with its port of Praia, had a substantial population that was a mixture of Portuguese settlers, freed slaves, and the various other people who had accumulated there over centuries of Atlantic commerce. The town was modest in its amenities, considerably less comfortable than Funchal, but it offered what a reprovisioning stop required. The climate of the Cape Verdes was warm and dry, at the margin of the Saharan influence that extended across the ocean from the African mainland. The islands received limited rainfall, and fresh water was a more constrained resource than in Madeira's wetter climate. The trade in water was conducted with this scarcity in mind. Not all voyages heading for India stopped at the Cape Verdes. The decision to stop or to continue depended on the state of the ship's provisions, the state of the weather, and the captain's judgment about the most efficient route. A vessel well provisioned from Madeira and making good time south might bypass the Cape Verdes entirely and proceed directly toward the equatorial crossing. The crossing of the equator was a significant event on any voyage that crossed it, and it had been marked by maritime tradition for centuries. The ceremony of crossing the line, in which those making the equatorial crossing for the first time were subjected to various rituals by those who had done it before, was a regular feature of voyages in this period, adapted in formality and elaborateness to the character of the particular ship and the patience of the captain for this kind of entertainment. The ceremonies ranged from quite elaborate performances, with crew members dressed as Neptune, and various courtiers, speeches and mock trials, and various initiatory indignities inflicted on the first-time crossers, to much simpler acknowledgments of the occasion on an East Indiaman with both crew and passengers crossing for the first time. The ceremony was often a reasonably significant social occasion, providing entertainment and a marked moment in what was otherwise an undifferentiated succession of days at sea. The equatorial region itself was navigated with attention to the particular winds and currents of that part of the ocean. The doldrums, the region of light and variable winds that lay near the equator, could hold a sailing vessel for days or even weeks if the wind failed entirely. The alternation between flat calms and brief squalls that characterized this zone was frustrating for a ship trying to make progress, and the heat of the equatorial sun, beating down on a vessel that was making slow or no progress, added an additional discomfort to the difficulties of navigation. A vessel in the doldrums spent time in a particular kind of maritime suspension. The sails hung slack. The surface of the sea was oily and flat in the calms, ruffled only by the brief squalls that came and went without providing sustained movement. Fishing over the side was a common occupation, and the equatorial Atlantic contained large and varied fish that were a welcome addition to the ship's provisions. Flying fish, which could be found jumping at the bow of the vessel, sometimes landed on deck and were added to the cook's larder. Dolphins frequently accompanied vessels through this region, moving in and out of the bow wave in a way that was both impressive and entirely practical from their perspective, using the pressure wave of the ship's passage to reduce their own swimming effort. Once past the equator and into the South Atlantic, the wind patterns changed again. The southeast trade winds, the counterpart in the southern hemisphere of the northeast trades above the equator, could be picked up as the vessel proceeded south and east toward the African coast and eventually the Cape of Good Hope. The southeast trades were a steady and reliable source of wind for this section of the voyage, and a vessel that had entered them and could hold a course that used them well could make consistent progress. The South Atlantic was a vast and relatively featureless expanse of water. The only land it contained were a few isolated islands, St. Helena among them, that were significant precisely because of their isolation and the provisioning they offered to vessels on the long passage around Africa. The distances involved in crossing the South Atlantic were substantial, and the absence of intermediate stopping points meant that a vessel's provisions had to be managed over an extended period without resupply. The management of the ship's stores was an ongoing concern of the ship's officers, particularly the purser, whose responsibility it was to maintain the records of what was on board and to manage its consumption in a way that ensured adequate supplies for the entire voyage. The purser kept detailed accounts of every barrel of water, every bag of flour, every cask of salt meat, and issued rations according to a schedule that was designed to last the voyage to India with a reasonable margin. Water was, as always, the most critical item. The large water casks in the hold represented a fixed supply that diminished every day. The calculation of how much water was available per head per day and how that allowance needed to be managed to ensure it lasted was a continuous background concern. Water for drinking had first claim, water for cooking was next, water for washing and other personal use was what remained after those needs were met, and that residue could be quite small by the later stages of a long passage without reprovisioning. The island of St. Helena, rising steeply from the South Atlantic at the latitude of approximately 16 degrees south, was one of the most important staging posts on the India route. The island belonged to the East India Company, which had held it since 1659, and it had been developed specifically to serve the needs of the company's shipping on the India route. It was a fortified settlement with a small permanent population, a garrison, farms and gardens that produced fresh provisions, and the administrative infrastructure necessary to manage the reprovisioning of the company's vessels. The approach to St. Helena by sea involved navigating carefully to find the island, which, despite its size of approximately 47 square miles, was easily missed in the vast expanse of the South Atlantic if navigation was slightly off. The island had been specifically chosen by the company partly because its isolation made it defensible. A vessel attempting to attack it had to approach across open ocean, where it could be seen, but that same isolation meant that finding it required accurate navigation. When the island was sighted, typically first as a dark mass on the horizon that might initially be mistaken for a cloud, the effect on the ship's company after weeks of empty ocean was significant. The island represented fresh water, fresh food, solid ground, and a degree of connection to the inhabited world that had been absent for the preceding weeks of the passage. Jamestown, the island's only town, was located in a narrow valley between steep cliffs on the western side of the island. The anchorage was an open roadstead, exposed to swell that could make the landing difficult in bad weather, but in typical conditions, boats could run from the ship to the landing place without much difficulty. The town was small but provided the essential services that passing vessels needed, and the island's farms and gardens provided the fresh provisions that were most welcome after a long passage. The garrison at St. Helena maintained the island's defenses against the possibility of French attack, which in 1800 was not a negligible concern given the state of the war. The island's position on the route home from India also made it a potential target, since it was where homeward-bound Indiamen regularly stopped and where their valuable cargoes might be at a moment of relative vulnerability. The time spent at St. Helena was typically a week to 10 days, long enough to take on water and provisions, carry out any necessary repairs, and allow the crew and passengers some respite from the continuous confinement of the ship. Letters could again be written and left for forwarding to England, and any mail that had been sent ahead via faster vessels might be awaiting the ship at the island's post office. Leaving St. Helena and proceeding east-southeast toward the Cape of Good Hope, The character of the voyage changed again. The South Atlantic in the higher latitudes was a place of stronger and more variable winds, the beginning of the belt of westerlies that circles the southern hemisphere and drives the ocean currents. The temperature dropped noticeably as the vessel moved south toward the latitude of the Cape, which sits at approximately 34 degrees south. The Cape of Good Hope, on the southwestern tip of the African continent, was the point where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans met, and it was one of the most significant navigational waypoints on the entire route to India. The waters around the Cape were known for their difficult conditions. The combination of strong westerly winds, the cold Benguela current flowing north along the African coast, and the geography of the continental shelf created sea conditions that could be extremely rough. And the Cape had a long history in the accounts of mariners as a place of difficulty. In practical terms, the Cape region's weather was highly variable. The dominant pattern brought strong westerlies, which were actually useful for a vessel that wanted to round the Cape and enter the Indian Ocean, since westerly winds would push the vessel east around the Cape and into the calmer waters beyond. But the westerlies could be very strong, and the seas they generated were large and long, the deep ocean swells of the southern hemisphere, where there was no landmass to break the fetch of wind and wave over thousands of miles of open ocean. A vessel rounding the Cape in a strong westerly gale was under considerable strain. The rigging had to be managed carefully, with heavy weather sails set and the more vulnerable light sails taken in and secured. The crew worked in conditions that were physically demanding and potentially dangerous, handling wet canvas and heavy lines on a vessel that was pitching and rolling in the large Southern Ocean swells. Officers maintained constant watch over the navigation, ensuring that the ship was keeping adequate distance from the African coast and any shoals that might be in the path. Passengers in this section of the voyage retreated to their cabins and endured. The motion of the vessel in Southern Ocean swells was of a different character from the Channel chop, or even the trade wind seas of the tropics. The swells were long and deep, and a vessel moving through them rolled steadily and heavily in a way that was difficult to ignore, regardless of one's usual tolerance for the sea's motion. Everything that was not secured moved. The contents of a cabin were constantly in need of management. Sleeping required bracing against the roll. The Cape Colony, which had been British since 1795 and would be returned briefly to the Batavian Republic before becoming firmly British again in 1806, had Cape Town as its administrative and commercial center. The town at the foot of Table Mountain was a well-established colonial settlement by 1800. With a history of Dutch East India Company administration that had left it with the infrastructure of a proper reprovisioning port, the famous role for which it had been founded a century and a half earlier, the view of Cape Town from the sea was striking in a way that even the most jaded traveler commented on. Table Mountain, flat-topped and substantial, formed the backdrop of the town, and when the famous tablecloth of cloud sat on its summit and spilled over the edges, it was distinctive enough to serve as a navigational landmark, as well as a notable site. The bay in front of the town, Table Bay, was an open anchorage exposed to northerly winds, which meant that vessels anchored there in a northerly gale were at risk of dragging anchor or being driven ashore, a hazard that had claimed numerous ships over the Cape Town roadstead's long history. In the Cape's winter months, such northerly storms were not uncommon, but in the summer months when most India-bound vessels arrived, the weather was generally favorable, and Table Bay provided a comfortable anchorage with good access to the town. The landing was at a stone jetty that had been built by the Dutch administration and extended since. And the business of coming ashore involved the usual boats and the usual management of the landing. Cape Town, in 1800, was a place of considerable commercial activity, serving as it did the needs of vessels from multiple European nations on multiple ocean routes. The Dutch had founded it as a refreshment station for the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and its original purpose of providing fresh vegetables, meat, water, and wine to passing vessels had been maintained and expanded over the intervening century and a half. The farms in the fertile valleys behind the town produced food in sufficient quantity for both the local population and the extensive passing trade. The wines of the Cape, particularly the Constantia wines produced from the vineyards on the peninsula, were beginning to acquire the reputation that would make them famous in the early 19th century. A passenger stopping at Cape Town in 1800 had the opportunity to acquire Cape wine for the remaining portion of the voyage, and many did. The Constantia sweet wine was particularly sought after, a rich and sweet wine that kept well and that was fashionable in England and among Europeans generally. The stop at Cape Town was typically longer than at Madeira or St. Helena, often 2 to 3 weeks, partly because the Cape was a larger and more complete reprovisioning station, and partly because there was often more ship's business to conduct. Any serious maintenance issues that had developed during the voyage from England could be addressed in Cape Town's yards. Crew changes sometimes occurred here. Additional passengers might join the vessel for the India portion of the voyage. The Society of Cape Town was organized around the colonial administration and the commercial community that served passing trade, with a significant Dutch-descended population that had been in the Cape for several generations. The British had only recently taken over the administration, and the relationships between the British newcomers and the established Cape Dutch community were still being worked out. For passengers on India-bound vessels, who were English and connected to the colonial enterprise, Cape Town offered a recognizable social environment, while also being distinctly different from England. The excursions available from Cape Town included visits to the farms in the surrounding valleys, and for the more adventurous, climbs partway up Table Mountain, from which the panorama of the Cape Peninsula and the surrounding ocean was notable. These excursions, conducted on horseback or in hired carriages, provided the kind of physical exercise and fresh air that the long voyage had not offered, and they were undertaken with enthusiasm by those who had the energy and the inclination. The provisioning taken on at Cape Town set the ship up for the Indian Ocean passage, which was the next and final major section of the route. The Indian Ocean was different in character from the Atlantic, with its own wind systems and currents and navigational challenges, and the provisions needed to be adequate for the remaining weeks of the voyage. The Indian Ocean in 1800 was well understood in its seasonal patterns by experienced navigators. The defining feature of the Indian Ocean, distinguishing it from the Atlantic, was the monsoon, the seasonal reversal of the dominant wind direction that drove commerce and navigation throughout the region and had done so for millennia before European involvement. The southwest monsoon blows from roughly May through September, carrying moisture from the ocean over the Indian subcontinent and bringing the monsoon rains that were the defining feature of Indian agriculture and climate. During this period, winds blow from the southwest across the Indian Ocean, which was favorable for vessels traveling from the African coast toward India, but less favorable for the return journey. The northeast monsoon blows from roughly November through March, reversing the pattern and blowing from the northeast across the northern Indian Ocean. This was favorable for the return voyage from India toward the African coast and the Cape of Good Hope. The timing of the voyage was therefore important, and the East India Company planned its sailings with the monsoon cycle in mind. Outward-bound vessels ideally arrived in the Indian Ocean during the southwest monsoon or at the transition between monsoons, when they could use the prevailing winds to carry them north and east toward the Indian coast. Homeward-bound vessels waited for the northeast monsoon to facilitate their departure. Getting the timing wrong had consequences. A vessel that arrived in the Indian Ocean at the wrong point in the monsoon cycle might face headwinds for much of the passage, adding weeks to the voyage and increasing the consumption of provisions. The best-laid plans of the departure calendar were also subject to the delays that accumulated over the course of the voyage. A slow passage through the Channel, extended time in the doldrums, rough weather around the Cape, all of which could shift the arrival in the Indian Ocean relative to the monsoon timetable. The passage across the Indian Ocean from the Cape took the vessel northeast, following the established route that used the prevailing winds most efficiently. The Indian Ocean, in the southwest monsoon season, was a place of regular and reliable winds across much of its extent, and a vessel that had caught the monsoon and was running before it could make impressive daily distances. The long swells of the Indian Ocean, generated by the consistent winds over vast fetches of open water, gave the vessel a steady and purposeful motion that was different from the variable conditions of the South Atlantic. The color of the water changed perceptibly as the vessel moved into the Indian Ocean. The deep blue of the open ocean gave way to greener hues in the shallower water approaching the Indian coast, and eventually to the specific character of the Arabian Sea or the Bay of Bengal, depending on the vessel's destination. The water temperature also changed, the cold influence of the Benguela Current and the Southern Ocean giving way to the warmer Indian Ocean water as the vessel progressed north. The marine life of the Indian Ocean was distinct from that of the Atlantic. Large pelagic fish, tuna and bonito, and various others followed vessels through these waters. Flying fish were common. Occasional sea turtles were seen. Closer to the Indian coast, the character of the ocean changed further, with the specific biological productivity of the coastal waters showing in changed water color and the presence of birds not seen in the open ocean. The approach to the Indian coast was made with careful attention to navigation. The western coast of India and the approaches to the major ports of Bombay on the Malabar coast and Madras on the Coromandel coast required navigational skill. The charts of the period, though considerably better than they had been a century earlier, were not uniformly reliable, and the experience of local pilots who knew the specific hazards of particular harbors was essential for the final approach. The coastline of India, first seen from a vessel approaching after months at sea, was a significant moment for everyone on board. Passengers who had left England in the spring and arrived in the summer or autumn had been at sea for 4 to 6 months. The end of the voyage was visible and approaching. The destination varied depending on the voyage's purpose and the particular arrangements of the East India Company's trade and administration. The three presidencies, Bengal with its headquarters at Calcutta, Madras on the Coromandel coast, and Bombay on the western coast, were the principal British presences in India in 1800, and the major ports associated with each were the arrival points for incoming vessels. Bombay, which a vessel arriving from England via the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean might reach by proceeding up the Malabar coast, was an island connected to the mainland by the shallow waters of the harbour and the tidal flats that surrounded it. The harbour at Bombay was one of the better natural harbours on the western Indian coast, deep enough for large vessels and sheltered enough to provide reasonable anchorage in most conditions. The East India Company had been in Bombay since 1661 and had developed it significantly over the intervening century and a half. The approach to Bombay by sea involved navigating through the various islands and rocks of the outer harbour under the guidance of a pilot who had been sent out from the port. The first sight of the settlement from the harbour approach showed a low-lying island with the fort and the associated European settlement visible at the southern end, backed by the slightly higher ground of the island's interior. Madras, on the eastern Coromandel coast, was less fortunately situated for maritime purposes. It had no natural harbour, and vessels had to anchor in an open roadstead off the town, exposed to the northeast monsoon and the rough seas it could bring. Landing at Madras was notoriously difficult in rough weather, conducted in flat-bottomed boats called Masula boats that were specifically designed to handle the surf, rowed by highly skilled boatmen who could manage the boats through surf conditions that would have swamped conventional ships' boats. Calcutta, the headquarters of the Bengal Presidency, and by 1800, the seat of the Governor-General who held overall authority over British India was not directly on the coast at all. It was located on the Hooghly River, one of the distributaries of the Ganges, approximately 100 miles upriver from the Bay of Bengal. Reaching Calcutta from the sea required navigating the Hooghly, which was a significant navigational challenge due to the constantly shifting sandbanks that characterized the river mouth and the lower reaches of the river. The Hooghly was navigated with the assistance of pilots who knew the constantly changing channel. The sandbanks moved with every monsoon season, and the charts of the river were always to some degree out of date. Pilots who maintained their knowledge through regular experience on the river were indispensable, and the pilotage service on the Hooghly was one of the more demanding maritime professions in the region. Calcutta in 1800 was a city in the process of becoming the administrative and commercial capital of an expanding British presence in India. The East India Company had been trading in Bengal since the 17th century and had established its fortified settlement at Calcutta, Fort William, in 1690. Over the following century, the city had grown from a modest trading post into a substantial colonial metropolis. The European quarter of Calcutta, the area around the fort and along the river that was known as the White Town, was built in a relatively European style with brick and plaster buildings that attempted to recreate the physical character of an English city in a tropical climate. The wider city, extending into what was called the Black Town, where the Indian population was concentrated, was a more complex urban environment of narrow lanes, bazaars, temples, and domestic buildings that reflected the long history of the site and the layered character of its population. The climate of Calcutta was what greeted every new arrival from England with immediate and undeniable force. The heat was the first thing. Coming from the temperate climate of England, even after months at sea during which the temperature had gradually increased, the heat of Bengal in the warmer months was something that had to be experienced to be fully understood. The humidity added to the heat in ways that made physical activity uncomfortable and mental exertion difficult. The monsoon rains, when they came, provided some relief from the heat, but created their own challenges of flooding and mud and the insects that bred in standing water. The adjustment to the Indian climate was one of the most significant challenges facing new arrivals in 1800, and the inability to adjust was one of the principal causes of the high mortality that Europeans experienced in India. Malaria, transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito that bred in the standing water left by the monsoon, was endemic throughout the region. Cholera, spread through contaminated water and food, periodically swept through the city in epidemic form. Dysentery was common. The various fevers that were collectively described under general terms that covered a range of specific diseases were responsible for large numbers of European deaths every year. The term seasoning, borrowed from earlier colonial contexts, was used to describe the period of adjustment during which new arrivals were most vulnerable to the diseases of the climate. The first year or two after arrival was understood to be the most dangerous, after which surviving Europeans were considered to have been seasoned and to have acquired some degree of resistance or adaptation. This concept had some basis in the real immunity that survivors of specific diseases acquired, though the theory underlying it was not precisely accurate. The woman who had watched the cart being loaded in Leadenhall Street would have arrived in Calcutta, if that was her destination, after a voyage of roughly 4 to 6 months, passing through the climatic zones of the North Atlantic, the Equatorial Ocean, the South Atlantic, the Cape region, and the Indian Ocean. She would have been at sea for the large majority of that time, with brief intervals on land at Madeira, possibly the Cape Verdes, St. Helena, and Cape Town. The person she was upon arrival was in some respects the same person who had left London, and in other respects significantly changed. The months at sea had established a daily rhythm that was entirely unlike anything from land life. The company of the ship, the same small community of officers, passengers, and crew for months of close proximity, had created social patterns and relationships that would dissolve when the ship arrived, but would be remembered for years. The physical experience of the voyage, the range of climates, the occasional rough weather, the extended periods of calm and monotony, had been accumulated into the body in ways that were not always consciously noticed. The arrival in Calcutta, anchoring in the Hooghly, and waiting for the boat that would bring the pilot alongside, followed by the slow progress upriver with the shore gradually emerging from the featureless character of the lower delta into something recognizable as a populated riverbank, and eventually the first sight of the fort and the city and the masts of other vessels at anchor was the end of one thing, and the beginning of something entirely new. But the logistics of the arrival were still to be managed, and they were not simple. Coming ashore in a boat from the anchored vessel, dealing with the customs and port formalities that applied even to company employees, arranging transport from the riverside to wherever one was to be accommodated, all of this was conducted in a city that was completely unfamiliar, in a climate that was immediately difficult, with luggage that had survived months at sea in various states of preservation. The trunks that had been loaded onto that cart in Leadenhall Street arrived in India changed by their journey. The humidity of the tropics and the motion of the ship had affected the contents in various ways. Clothes that had been packed carefully in England arrived somewhat the worse for the journey. Books that had not been kept in absolutely watertight containers might show the effects of moisture. Metal items, if they had not been properly oiled and wrapped, might show rust. The various foodstuffs and provisions that had been included in the luggage were in whatever state the voyage had left them. The process of unpacking and assessing what had survived the voyage and what had not was one of the practical tasks of the first days in India, conducted in a rented house or in the guest accommodation that the company maintained for newly arrived employees, while also dealing with the heat and the noise and the smell and the general sensory intensity of an Indian city in the early 19th century. The infrastructure that supported the passage to India, the ports and provisioning stations and insurance markets and shipping companies and outfitters and pilots and all the rest, had been built up over 2 centuries of regular commerce between England and India. It represented an enormous collective investment of capital, knowledge, and institutional effort that made the voyage possible and gave it its characteristic shape. The East India Company at the center of this system was not merely a trading organization. By 1800, it was an institution of unusual complexity, combining commercial functions with governmental ones, operating its own fleet of ships, its own ports and fortifications, its own civil and military establishments in India, and its own regulatory apparatus that governed who could trade in what and on what terms. It was, in important respects, the organizational backbone of British India at this period, and the passage to India was inseparable from the company's structures and procedures. A company's servant, which was the term for the civil employees of the company at all levels, obtained his passage through a specific process of company patronage. The directors of the company in London appointed writers, the most junior grade of company civil servant, to the various presidencies, and these appointments were valuable pieces of patronage that directors distributed among their connections and in response to various political pressures. A young man hoping to go to India in the company's service needed to find a director willing to nominate him, and this required either family connection, social connection, or the ability to offer some consideration that made the nomination worthwhile. Once nominated, the new writer entered Haileybury College, the institution that the company established in 1806, though before that date training was more informal, to receive some preparation for his duties. He was equipped at the company's expense with certain basic necessities of outfit, though what the company provided was minimal, and most of the serious outfitting was done at personal expense. The private traders and merchants who traveled to India outside the company's structure had their own routes through the bureaucratic requirements of the voyage. The company's monopoly on trade with India, which had been somewhat relaxed but not eliminated by this period, meant that private individuals who wanted to trade in India had to operate within a regulatory framework that was controlled by the company. Obtaining a license to trade or taking advantage of the private trade privileges that company employees were entitled to required navigating these arrangements carefully. The missionaries and other religious travelers who were beginning to try to reach India by this period faced their own particular complications. The company was officially opposed to missionary activity in India on the grounds that it would disturb the religious sensibilities of the Indian population and make the company's position more difficult. This did not prevent all missionary activity, but it did mean that those who wanted to pursue it had to find ways around the company's resistance, whether through the private trade routes, through foreign carriers, or through the Danish settlements in India that were not subject to the company's restrictions in the same way. The doctors, naturalists, artists, and other individuals who had reasons to go to India beyond commerce or administration were similarly constrained by the company's framework. A naturalist who wanted to study Indian flora and fauna needed access to the country that the company controlled, and obtaining that access required the company's cooperation, or at least its acquiescence. The collections of natural history specimens and the scientific observations that came back from India through this period were therefore shaped by the administrative structures that governed access to the subcontinent. The return voyage from India to England followed essentially the same route in reverse, but the monsoon timing constraints meant that it was often somewhat different in its specific course. A vessel leaving Calcutta or Madras in the appropriate season, roughly November through February, caught the northeast monsoon for the passage south through the Bay of Bengal and around the tip of India, then proceeded southwest across the Indian Ocean toward the Cape of Good Hope. The homeward voyage was in many respects more comfortable than the outward one. Passengers who had spent years in India had fully adapted to shipboard life in a way that recent arrivals had not. Those who were returning home after years of service in India had a specific psychological orientation toward the voyage that was different from the apprehension and uncertainty of the outward journey. The end point was something familiar and anticipated rather than unknown. The vessels returning from India carried a different cargo from those going out. Tea from China, obtained through the company's Canton operations, was the largest single commodity. Cotton textiles from various parts of India, saltpeter, indigo, and various other goods made up the rest of the cargo. The holds of a homeward-bound East Indiaman were valuable in ways that had implications for the insurance and management of the voyage. The stop at St. Helena on the way home was similarly organized to the stop on the way out, providing water, provisions, and the opportunity to deal with any ship's business that had accumulated. Letters were written home with the news of the voyage's progress. The mail that might have been waiting at St. Helena for homeward-bound passengers was eagerly examined. Cape Town on the homeward voyage was approached from the east, navigating around the Cape in whatever weather prevailed, and the anchorage and the town offered the same amenities as before, refreshed by the long passage from India. The reprovisioning for the remaining Atlantic crossing was conducted here, and the Cape wines and fresh provisions were loaded with the same enthusiasm as on the outward voyage. The passage of the South Atlantic northward from the Cape toward the equatorial region involved using the trade winds of both hemispheres in sequence, catching the southeast trades to push north and then transferring to the northeast trades for the final passage toward the Canary Islands and Europe. The timing of the equatorial crossing and the management of the doldrums region that lay between the two trade wind belts was one of the navigational challenges of the homeward voyage. The Canary Islands, or the Azores, depending on the specific route, sometimes served as final provisioning stops before the home port. The Azores in particular, in the mid-Atlantic, were a useful stopping point for vessels that had been at sea for an extended period and needed to top up water or provisions before the final leg to England. The Portuguese islands were well provided with fresh food and water, and the anchorage at Faial or Terceira was comfortable in settled weather. The final approach to England through the Channel and up to the Thames or to Portsmouth or wherever the vessel was bound was made with the same care as the departure. The Channel navigation required attention. The pilot at the outer anchorage represented the return of institutional support after the long independence of the open ocean voyage. The smell of the land, after months of the salt-free air of the open sea, was something that everyone on board noticed. The documentation that surrounded the India voyage was substantial. The vessel's log recorded every significant event of the passage, the positions taken at noon each day, the winds and weather, any encounters with other vessels, any incidents aboard, the births and deaths that occurred during the voyage. These logs were required to be submitted to the company on the vessel's return and provided the raw material for the navigational knowledge that the company accumulated about the route. The company maintained a detailed archive of this information, and its servants in the hydrographic and navigational departments used it to produce improved charts and sailing directions over time. The Rennell current, named for James Rennell, who studied the Indian Ocean currents using accumulated voyage records, was one of the pieces of geographical knowledge that emerged from this systematic accumulation of navigational data. The account books of the voyage recorded the financial transactions that occurred at each stopping point, the provisions purchased, the fees paid, the various commercial operations that accompanied the passage. These records were the foundation of the commercial accounting that the company required from its ships. The personal papers of passengers, the letters written at each stopping point and sent back to England, the journals and diaries that many kept during the voyage, the sketches and watercolors made of the places visited, all of these constituted a separate category of documentation that was personal rather than institutional. Many of these have survived in private archives and published memoirs, providing the texture of individual experience that the official logs and account books do not. The woman who had watched the cart in Leadenhall Street kept, as it turned out, a journal. Many women traveling to India in this period kept journals, partly out of the genuine desire to record and process an unusual experience, and partly out of the social practice of keeping up with the events of one's life in a form that could be shared with family and friends at home. The journal, written in stages over the months of the voyage, recorded the first sighting of the coast of Portugal from a distance, the arrival at Madeira and the excursion to Aquintas above the town, the crossing of the equator and the ceremony that accompanied it, the approach to the Cape through rough weather, the stop at Cape Town, and a visit to the Constantia vineyards, the long blue days of the Indian Ocean passage, and finally the first sight of the Indian coast appearing on the eastern horizon. She wrote about the food and about the heat and about the other passengers, and about the particular quality of moonlight on the open ocean far from any land. She wrote about being seasick in the Channel and about not being seasick afterward. She wrote about the dolphins at the bow and the flying fish that came over the rail. She noted the temperature in her journal and the state of the wind in a way that reflected the general maritime preoccupation with these things that pervaded shipboard life. She wrote very little about being frightened. The voyage to India in 1800, taken in an East Indiaman on an established route with experienced officers and adequate provisions, was not generally a frightening undertaking. It was long and uncomfortable and sometimes boring and occasionally rough. But the East India Company's vessels were well built and well managed by the standards of the period, and the route was sufficiently established that the major navigational uncertainties had been reduced to manageable levels. What she wrote about mostly was the texture of ordinary days, what was eaten and when, who said what at dinner, what the sky looked like at different times, how the light changed as they moved from one latitude to another, how different the smell of the Cape was from the smell of the open ocean, how the Hooghly looked in the early morning with the mist rising off the water. The daily schedule on an East Indiaman was organized around the ship's needs and the social conventions of the period, and it was remarkably consistent from day to day in a way that over months became completely natural. The day began early. The watch that had been on duty through the night was relieved at 4 or 8 in the morning, depending on the watch schedule, and the activity of the changing watch woke most people on the ship, regardless of whether they were on the watch themselves. The crew began the day's maintenance and cleaning, which included washing down the decks with seawater using mops and swabs. A daily ritual that kept the wooden decks from drying out in the sun and which produced the characteristic smell of wet wood and salt water that was part of the sensory background of shipboard life. Breakfast for cabin passengers was served in the saloon at a time that varied somewhat by ship and captain, typically around 8 in the morning. Breakfast in this period was a substantial meal with bread and butter and preserved meats and cheese, and sometimes eggs when they were available, accompanied by tea or coffee. The quality of the bread declined as the voyage progressed, and the ship's baker moved from fresh-baked bread to biscuit, but the other elements of the breakfast remained relatively constant. After breakfast, the late morning hours were the most social part of the day, when passengers and officers who were not on watch could be found on the quarterdeck or in the saloon, reading, writing, playing cards, or simply talking. The quarterdeck of an East Indiaman was the passenger's primary social space when the weather was fine enough to be outside, and the routine of walking the quarterdeck in the morning, getting exercise and fresh air while watching the sea and the sails, was one of the defining activities of the voyage. The midday observation was one of the fixed points of the ship's day. At noon, or as close to noon as the weather allowed, the ship's officers took a sight of the sun with their sextants to determine the ship's latitude. The sextant, introduced in the mid-18th century, had significantly improved the accuracy with which latitude could be measured at sea, and the noon sighting was the primary means by which the ship's daily position was confirmed. The ritual of the noon observation was conducted with some ceremony. The captain and the first officer, and sometimes junior officers who were developing their navigational skills, gathered on the quarterdeck as noon approached, sextants in hand, watching the sun's altitude as it reached its maximum. The moment of maximum altitude was noon, and the angle at which the sun stood above the horizon at that moment, combined with knowledge of the sun's declination for that date from the nautical almanac, gave the ship's latitude directly. The longitude was a different matter, still determined primarily by dead reckoning in 1800, though the marine chronometer was by this time available and the best-equipped vessels carried one. A chronometer that had been accurately set to Greenwich time before departure allowed the officer taking the noon sight to determine not just the local time, which was noon, but also the difference between local time and Greenwich time, from which the longitude could be calculated. The more chronometers a vessel carried, the more reliably the longitude could be determined, since comparing multiple chronometers allowed the navigator to identify if any of them was running significantly fast or slow. After the noon observation, the ship's position was marked on the chart and the previous day's run calculated, the distance made good from the previous noon to the current one. This figure, the daily run, was a matter of general interest on the ship. A good day's run of 150 miles or more, in favorable conditions, generated a mild satisfaction. A poor run of 50 miles or less, in light winds or in the doldrums, was a source of frustration. The accumulated daily runs were the most direct measure of the voyage's progress. The afternoon was the warmest part of the day in the tropical portions of the voyage, and the ship took on a somewhat quieter character as passengers retreated from the heat of the direct sun into whatever shade was available. Awnings were sometimes rigged over the quarterdeck to provide shade, and these were particularly welcome in the equatorial and Indian Ocean portions of the voyage. Reading was the most common individual occupation during the afternoon hours, The books that passengers had brought from England were the primary reading material, and the choice of what to bring was therefore a significant decision made before departure. Travel accounts of India, histories of the East India Company, novels, works of history and natural history, poetry. These were the standard components of a good shipboard library. Books were also borrowed and exchanged between passengers, and the social reading of passages aloud to others in the saloon or on deck was a common entertainment. The ship's surgeon, who was a significant figure in the daily life of the vessel, held his daily sick call in the afternoon, at which the crew members and passengers who had medical complaints presented themselves for examination and treatment. The medical conditions that appeared on a long voyage ranged from the routine cuts and bruises from the ordinary hazards of working on a ship to the more serious, the various febrile illnesses and digestive complaints that were endemic in the conditions of the voyage. The surgeon's medicine chest contained the standard pharmacopoeia of the early 19th century, which included various preparations that ranged from genuinely useful to entirely ineffective. Opium preparations, which were effective for managing pain and certain kinds of diarrhea, were present in most medicine chests. Quinine, extracted from Peruvian bark, was known to be effective against malaria and was available, though the mechanism of its action was not understood. Various other preparations, purges and emetics and tonics, were used according to the medical theories of the period, with variable results. Dinner was the main meal of the day and the most important social occasion on the ship. It was typically served in the early to mid-afternoon, around 2 or 3 o'clock, which was the convention of the period in England as well. The captain presided over the cabin table, and the meal was served with a degree of formality appropriate to the social standing of the passengers present. The food at dinner reflected the resources available at the point of the voyage. In the early stages, after a reprovisioning stop, there might be fresh meat, fresh vegetables, and good bread. In the later stages of a long passage without stops, the dinner might be entirely from preserved stocks, salt meat or salt fish, dried vegetables, and biscuit. The ship's cook worked within these constraints with varying skill and creativity. Wine was served at dinner, and the management of the wine supply over the course of the voyage was another of the many logistical concerns of the cabin. The Madeira taken on at the island of that name was the staple, supplemented by Cape wine from the Cape Town stop and whatever had been brought from England. A well-managed wine supply lasted the voyage comfortably. A poorly managed one ran out before the end and left the remaining portion of the voyage relying on whatever grog or spirits remained. The conversation at dinner, over months of daily repetition, ranged over everything that could be discussed by the particular collection of people present. India was a natural subject, particularly among those who were going there for the first time and those who were returning after a period at home. The politics of the company, the conditions in the various presidencies, the prospects for the war with Napoleon and its implications for trade and administration, the practical questions of how to manage a household in Calcutta. All of these and many more filled the hours at table. Evening brought a change in the character of the day. After dinner, the cabin saloon was the location for cards and conversation, and the evening hours could stretch late. The officers who were not on watch joined the passengers for the evening's entertainment, and the social atmosphere of the ship's company was at its most relaxed during this time. Music was a not uncommon entertainment. Passengers who played instruments had sometimes brought them, and informal concerts or singing were part of the evening life of ships that happened to contain musical passengers and crew. The piano, too large and too delicate for most ships, was not typically present, but fiddles and flutes and voices were. The transition from the warm amber light of the tropical evening into the deep darkness of the open ocean night was one of the more notable regular experiences of the voyage. Far from any land in the equatorial or Indian Ocean passages, the night sky offered a clarity and completeness that was simply not available from anywhere in England. The Milky Way, visible as a broad band from horizon to horizon, the southern constellations unfamiliar to eyes trained on the northern sky. The absolute darkness of a night when the moon had set and there were no artificial lights of any kind. These experiences accumulated over the months of the voyage into something that passengers remembered for years. The night watch continued through all of this, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, bell by bell, the crew maintaining the running of the ship through the dark hours with the same attention as through the day. The helmsman at the wheel held the course by the compass. The watch officer kept his eyes on the sails and the sea ahead. The lookout at the bow watched for anything in the water that should not be there. A reef, another ship, floating wreckage. The medical and health challenges of the India voyage were distributed unevenly across its different sections. The early part of the voyage through European waters was generally the healthiest, because the passengers had recently left a familiar disease environment and had not yet encountered the new ones ahead. The equatorial section introduced some tropical diseases, and the stop at various ports introduced others, as crew and passengers came into contact with local disease environments. The Malabar coast and Bengal were understood to be particularly disease-ridden by the standards of European experience. The company maintained hospitals at its principal settlements, and a significant fraction of the European population in India at any given time was receiving medical care for one or another of the ailments that made India a medically demanding posting. The mortality among European company servants was high enough to be a significant factor in the company's planning and administration, because maintaining an adequate staff in India required a continuous flow of new arrivals to replace those who had died or who had returned home invalided. The specific diseases that killed most Europeans in India during this period were malaria and what was called cholera, as well as various ill-defined febrile conditions that the medicine of the period could not always distinguish from each other. The monsoon season, which brought the rains that were essential to Indian agriculture, also created the standing water in which the Anopheles mosquito bred, and the risk of malaria was particularly high in the weeks immediately following the monsoon rains. The advice available to new arrivals in India about how to protect their health was a mixture of genuinely useful practices and useless ones, shaped by the theoretical frameworks of the period and by the accumulated practical experience of those who had survived. Keeping dry, wearing appropriate clothing, avoiding the evening air which was believed to carry miasmas, not overexerting in the heat of the day, being careful about what water one drank and what food one ate. All of these were given as guidance to new arrivals. Some of it was genuinely protective. Some was based on incorrect theories that happened to have protective effects through mechanisms not understood by those recommending them. The servants who accompanied European travelers to and from India were a significant element of the logistics of the voyage. Senior company officials and wealthy private travelers typically traveled with personal servants, sometimes English servants and sometimes Indian servants, who had entered their employment in India and were accompanying them to or from England. Traveling with servants added complexity to the logistical arrangements of the voyage. Additional passage had to be negotiated with the ship's captain. The accommodation of servants was in different and more basic spaces than that of their employers. The management of the relationship between European passengers and their servants, in the close quarters of a ship's passage, was one of the small social negotiations that extended voyages required. Indian servants who had accompanied their employers to England and were returning to India on the same vessel occupied an unusual social position, familiar with both English and Indian contexts, in a way that most people in either country were not. Their experiences during a stay in England and their observations about what they had seen were rarely documented in ways that have survived. But some accounts exist, and they give a somewhat different perspective on the India voyage from the standard European one. The language situation on the vessel was accordingly complex. Passengers and crew communicated in English. Company employees who had been in India and were returning spoke varying amounts of Hindustani or Bengali or one of the other Indian languages they had encountered in their work. Indian servants spoke the language of their home region and varying amounts of English. The practical communication across these language divides was managed with the creative pragmatism that extended contact between people of different linguistic backgrounds tends to generate. The position of women on the India voyage is worth considering in some detail because it was distinctive from that of the majority of the passengers and because the experiences of women travelers were recorded in ways that provide specific and detailed evidence about the voyage's character. Women traveling to India in 1800 did so primarily in one of a few categories. They were the wives of company officials or military officers, accompanying their husbands to their posting. They were widows of company men who were returning to England after the death of their husbands. They were young women, sometimes described in period sources as the fishing fleet, who were traveling to India in hopes of finding husbands among the eligible young company's servants and military officers stationed there. The proportion of women among passengers on India-bound vessels was considerably smaller than the proportion of men, reflecting the general character of the British Indian population in this period. The company's settlements in India were predominantly male environments, with European women representing a small minority of the European population. The social significance of European women in India was accordingly somewhat magnified by their rarity. The conditions on the voyage for women were in many respects the same as for men of the same social standing. Because the cabin accommodation was not segregated and the social life of the cabin was mixed, but there were aspects of the voyage that were specifically shaped by the presence of women, including the social conventions governing what women could appropriately do on deck and when, and the management of the physical requirements of the voyage, bathing, sanitary arrangements, and similar, in conditions of limited privacy. The accounts that women travelers left of the India voyage are among the more detailed and personal records of the experience, because the journal-keeping and letter-writing practices of the period were particularly well developed among educated women, and because their observations of the social character of the voyage were often more finely detailed than those of their male counterparts. The intellectual and cultural life of the voyage, such as it was, depended entirely on what the passengers and officers of a particular vessel happened to bring with them and to be interested in. A ship that happened to contain several people of literary or scientific inclination might develop a surprising richness of intellectual conversation over the months of the passage. A ship whose passenger list was primarily composed of young military officers going out for the first time might have a livelier and more physically active social character. The natural world observed from the deck of the ship provided a subject of common interest that cut across most of the social differences of the passenger list. The tropical birds seen at various points, the flying fish, the occasional whale or school of dolphins, the southern stars unfamiliar to northern eyes, the progression of the night sky as the ship moved from one hemisphere to the other. These were subjects that could be observed and discussed by everyone on board, regardless of their specific education or interests. Some passengers used the voyage to begin systematic observation of the natural world they were passing through, collecting specimens where possible, keeping records of what was seen and when, and contributing in small ways to the growing body of natural historical knowledge about the ocean. The interests of natural history were broadly shared among educated people of the period, and the long voyage provided time for observation and reflection that was simply not available in the normal pace of life on land. The ship's log, maintained by the officers primarily for navigational purposes, also recorded natural historical observations as a matter of course, noting unusual birds or marine animals seen, the temperature and color of the water, the presence of specific ocean currents. This record, accumulated across hundreds of voyages over decades, contributed to the systematic understanding of the Indian Ocean environment, that was developing through this period. The commerce that occurred at the various stopping points of the voyage reflected the specific character of each location. At Madeira, the primary commercial interaction was the purchase of wine, and the agents of the Madeira wine merchants were skilled at facilitating purchases by passing ships. At Cape Town, the range of goods available was broader, reflecting the Cape Colony's role as a crossroads of Atlantic and Indian Ocean commerce, and passengers might purchase Cape wines, preserved meats, fresh vegetables, and various other supplies. At St. Helena, the commercial activity was more circumscribed by the island's company ownership and the specific provisioning function for which it had been developed. The company's store on the island sold provisions at regulated prices, and the private trade that supplemented this was limited by the island's small population and limited production capacity. The prices at these stops varied and were not always favorable to purchasers. The merchants of Madeira and Cape Town were experienced at setting prices for passing trade, and they were aware that vessels on the India route were not in a position to shop around for better terms. The captains and pursers of company vessels had accumulated experience in negotiating these purchases over multiple voyages, and the company maintained records of prices paid at various ports that informed future negotiations. The personal purchases made by passengers at stopping points, the books, the wines, the small luxury items that were available in Cape Town that were not available in mid-ocean, were conducted on individual accounts and reflected individual preferences and budgets. For some passengers, these purchases were significant, both financially and in the sense that they represented the material culture of the voyage, tangible objects that would be carried into their lives in India as reminders of the journey. The social hierarchies of British India in 1800, which passengers were traveling toward, were already fully formed in the imaginations of those making the voyage for the first time, shaped by the accounts of those who had been and returned, and the published literature that described India to English readers. The company's service had its own elaborate gradations of precedence and protocol, and the positioning of individuals within these hierarchies was a matter of significant practical consequence for their lives in India. The precedence table of the Bengal Presidency, which governed the social order of precedence at official dinners and public occasions, was a document of remarkable elaborateness, specifying the relative rank of every category of civil, military, and judicial servant within the presidency's administration. Knowing one's place within this system and understanding the social implications was part of the preparation for India that passengers undertook during the voyage. The arrival in Calcutta or Madras was therefore not just a physical transition but a social one, from the relatively simple hierarchy of the ship's company to the complex and strictly maintained social architecture of the colonial settlement. Newcomers were evaluated immediately by the existing community, their social rank assessed, their connections noted, their prospects evaluated. The letters of introduction carried by most passengers were the formal mechanism through which this social integration began. The ships themselves, as working commercial vessels, had a life cycle that extended far beyond any single voyage. An East Indiaman was typically built to last for several decades, with regular refitting between voyages that maintained its seaworthiness and commercial capability. The yards at Blackwall and elsewhere along the Thames, and the company's own facilities at Bombay, were the primary locations where this maintenance work was done. The Bombay dockyard, built and maintained by the Parsi shipbuilding community that had been associated with the company's operations since the 17th century, was one of the most significant shipbuilding operations in Asia in this period. The Parsi shipwrights of Bombay had developed their own tradition that combined elements of Indian and European shipbuilding, and the vessels they produced built from Indian teak, which was naturally more resistant to tropical marine organisms than the European oak used in English-built ships, had a reputation for durability and quality. A vessel that had been built in Bombay and was maintained in the Bombay yard represented a physical synthesis of Indian craft tradition and European commercial requirements, staffed by European officers and an Indian crew for the portions of the voyage in Indian waters, and transitioning to a more fully European crew for the Atlantic portions. This mixed crewing pattern was common in the India trade and reflected the practical realities of labor availability at different points on the route. The Indian Lascars, as sailors from the Indian subcontinent and the wider Indian Ocean region were called, were a regular component of the crews of East Indiamen, particularly for the India side portions of the voyage. They had a long tradition of maritime employment in the Indian Ocean trade, and their skills in handling the specific vessels and routes of that ocean were well established. The company's reliance on this labor pool was both practical and economic, since Lascars were paid at lower rates than European sailors. The transition back to English waters at the end of the homeward voyage brought its own particular adjustments. People who had been in India for years found England changed in small ways and themselves changed in larger ones. The climate was the most immediate shock, the cold and the grey of an English autumn or winter, after years in the warmth of India, hitting with an intensity that recent arrivals in India had felt going the other way. The social adjustments were subtler but equally significant. English society in 1800 was changing rapidly, shaped by the Industrial Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and various other forces that created a somewhat different landscape from what the returning traveler had left. People who had been away for 5 or 10 years returned to find old connections changed or broken, family members aged, the familiar streets and buildings of home simultaneously exactly as remembered and subtly different. The wealth that some returned from India with transformed the landscapes of English counties as successful company servants built country houses and established themselves as landed gentry. The nabobs, as returning India men were popularly called, were a recognized social type in the early 19th century, associated with conspicuous wealth, exotic habits, and the specific mannerisms of a life spent partly in India. The social integration of returned India men and their families into English society was a process that was sometimes smooth and sometimes complicated, depending on the specific circumstances of the return and the character of the returning individual. Those who had done well financially and socially in India often did well in England, having the resources and the connections to establish themselves comfortably. Those who had done less well, who returned with modest means after long service, found the transition more difficult. The port of London that received the returning East Indiaman was the same port that had dispatched it months or years earlier, but seen from the perspective of arrival after a long absence, it had a different quality. The crowds and noise and smells of the Thames were familiar and also strange after the empty ocean. The pilot who came alongside in the outer approaches to guide the vessel up to its moorings was a human contact after days of seeing only one's own ship's company. The customs inspection, the formal process of declaring cargo and paying the relevant duties, was conducted by the company's customs agents with the thoroughness that the value of the cargo required. Tea, cotton, spices, and the various other goods from India and China that filled the hold were valuable commodities subject to significant duties, and the documentation of what had been brought and what was owed was a careful and extended process. The passengers came ashore in the order that precedence required, the senior figures first, and were received by whoever had come to meet them. The wives and children who had stayed in England while the husband and father was in India, the family members and friends who had maintained the connection through years of correspondence and occasional short visits home, the agents and representatives who had managed financial affairs in England while the principal was in India. All of these met the arriving vessel with their own versions of the relief and emotion that ended a long separation. The trunks came ashore in the end, changed by their years in India in ways that were immediately visible. Indian fabrics, books acquired in Calcutta, small objects purchased in Indian bazaars, the accumulation of years of living in a different world. These traveled with their owners back into the familiar environment of England and became part of the material record of a time that had passed. The voyage from London to India and back was not a singular event, but a system, repeated hundreds of times over the decades of the early 19th century, accumulating the generations of experience and knowledge and institutional development that shaped it into its characteristic form. Each individual voyage was in many respects unique, with its particular combination of passengers and crew, its specific weather and navigational experiences, its own sequence of events at the stopping points along the way, but across these individual variations, the shape of the voyage was consistent. The same ports, the same wind systems, the same seasonal rhythms, the same logistical challenges of provisioning and navigation and health management recurred voyage after voyage and shaped the shared experience of all those who made the passage. The men and women who accumulated this shared experience carried it with them in ways that influenced how they thought about distance and time and the nature of the physical world. A voyage of 4 to 6 months, in which one traversed roughly 15,000 miles of ocean and passed through the full range of the Earth's climate zones, produced a direct physical understanding of the planet's scale that could not be obtained from reading or from maps. The return of a vessel from India, sailing up the Thames with its cargo of tea and cotton and spices, was a small visible piece of the larger story of how the world was connected in the early 19th century and how those connections were maintained through the continuous and largely unspectacular work of ships and crews and all the infrastructure that supported them. The light on the Thames in late afternoon, when an East Indiaman was working its way up to its moorings after months at sea, fell at a particular angle over the water and the buildings of the South Bank and the waiting boats and the general activity of the river. The light was the light of England, different from the light of the Cape or the Indian Ocean or the equatorial Atlantic, and recognizable as such to anyone who had been away from it for any length of time. The vessel settled to its anchor or came alongside its berth with the particular small finality of a long voyage ending. The sails were taken in and secured, the lines were made fast. The sounds of the ship, the creak and movement that had been the background noise of months at sea, settled into stillness. The dock and the warehouse and the city were close again, and the ocean was far away, and the passage between them was something that had happened and was complete. The journals were put away. The letters that had been written at sea but not yet sent were dispatched at last. The trunks were loaded onto waiting carts, perhaps by the same men who had loaded them when they first left. The street sounds of London filled the place where the sounds of the sea had been. The voyage, with all that it had contained, passed into memory, where it would stay for the rest of a life, a long and specific form of knowing what the world was like between one point and another, measured out in days at sea.